Welcome to the Embodiment Podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with embodiment specialists from around the world. I'm your host, Mark Walsh. On the show today, Ariana Rabinovitch. So Ariana is one of my favorite American yoga teachers. Her book, Exposing Yoga Myths, is required reading for my yoga students. She's also got a cool membership site called Yoga Research and Beyond, which is sort of yoga sciencey type stuff. She's got the Yoga Beyond podcast, so she's used to being on podcasts and hosting podcasts. She's got all sorts of qualifications from kids yoga to all sorts of other stuff. Jason Brown's 500-hour training, lots and lots of cool stuff. One of the least bullshitty people in yoga. In my experience, welcome.
Thank you. I like that. One of the least bullshitty people in yoga. That's the highest compliment. I really like that. On
your website. You could also put an American yoga teacher who Mark Walsh tolerates. So you're so welcome. We've had a couple of points of contact before, which I really enjoy.
It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, and let's start with your story then. So how did you get into working with the body? Obviously, you had a career as some sort of gymnast or dancer before becoming a yoga teacher, right?
Obviously not. No, that's... I was probably one of the more awkward physically, and I was not into sports at all. I think I always wanted to be. And my mom was into yoga from a pretty young age and had a Raquel Welch book lying around, and also came home from a yoga retreat with a recording of the class. And I did it in the living room by myself one day and was hooked from that moment on. I think it was my way of connecting to my body as a teenager. And it was a very grounding experience. I was socially awkward and just insecure. I was moving around a lot when I was growing up. And I don't know, having that physical experience really, really helped me at that time in my life. And ever since then, it's been in my life in the background.
Great. And I just say for listeners, there is a little bit of banging in the background. That Ariana actually has some students she's hitting with a stick. It's building work, so we might have to part with that, but I'm happy to have you on the show. Okay, so your thing has kind of become yoga myths, yoga science. Like, what led you to feel like modern yoga needs this?
In my first trainings, that was what I was naturally drawn to. I was drawn to the scientific information, and it blossomed from there. Just the more that I read into science and then eventually research, I realized that the science didn't always corroborate what we were telling our students.
And what she means by that is most yoga teachers are full of shit.
I don't think they mean to be. Because I still say stuff that has no basis. It's just
right. No, I'm being a little less nice than you. So it is common, though, isn't it, that there's certain mythologies in yoga that are just perpetuated because someone's teacher told their teacher, and that person had authority and trust, and someone's passing that on with the best of intentions. However, and I think, for those out there that are listening from martial arts background or, other backgrounds, equally true in other arts, so I don't want people to think I'm picking on yoga, that people just pass these things on, and actually they're not necessarily the case when you look at what the evidence base is.
Yeah. No, and it's an interesting phenomenon. You're right that it doesn't only happen in yoga. I think there's a lot of psychology behind it. There's this need to follow people and be loyal to a T. That's something that I think perpetuates the mythology that gets thrown around in yoga. People want to be loyal. I don't know if it's father figures or replacing their religion with the body practice, but I think it's an interesting phenomenon.
Let's dig into that, because that's really interesting, because it's easy to sort of say, look, there's a lot of bullshit out there and you have to be careful, and that's true. But then it's also, first of all, it was coming from a paradigm of authority and lineage rather than a paradigm of evidence base.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Like patriarchy.
So all the Eastern arts were not coming from a paradigm of science. They were coming from a paradigm of the research, and inverted commas, was personal, and things can go wrong in that. And yes, there's an idealized view of that, but there certainly wasn't the kind of rigorous testing of theories that is essentially a Western phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
I'd include the Arabic world in that, but certainly it's that phenomenon wasn't really something the Indians did or the Japanese did or many of the kind of cultures that developed Asian arts.
Which is also interesting because I can't tell you how many times I've seen yoga referred to as a science in and of itself. And that's become an empty statement to me. I don't think that yoga is a science.
Research is the one I'm hearing used more and more. People in an attempt to claim credibility will say, oh, I've been researching this for many years. And what they mean is they've been personally practicing and experiencing, and that is valid to a degree. That's not nothing.
One kind of research, it's one kind of evidence. Yes.
Yeah, but it's certainly not a double-blind trial, for example. There's a reason Western science is much maligned by alternative communities, but it's still kind of as good as we get, I think, for testing our, medicine or, I never saw anyone in a court of law who didn't believe in evidence base.
Yeah.
Naturally, that's actually in our culture. So I want to get more into the science of why people may perpetuate myths, because I think, or the psychology of that, because I think what you just said was fascinating. And if we're going to be generous and say, look, people are just trying to help their students, what's going on with that?
Oh boy, it's a loaded question. Yes, I'm sure they want to help their students. I'm sure there is ego behind it of wanting always to have answers. I'm guilty of that. There might be a power dynamic of thinking that you know more than your student, that you know your student's body better than theirs. Yeah. Those are some of the dynamics that I can think of psychologically, but it's out of my realm. It's all, these are all things I just come up with,
No, because that's my realm. I'm fascinated by that. Like, it seems as well that rejecting Western culture is almost a part of it as well. There can be a way in which when people go to Asian art, they kind of reject Western culture, and often because science has done terrible things and isn't perfect, and for some very good reasons. But then it goes almost the other way, and they say evidence is no longer important to me. And what does that leave you with? Well, myth and lineage and superstition and what your teacher said. So there's all sorts of power dynamics, and then people get very invested, don't they, in certain stories which they've been. And once you've told 1,000 students something, do you really want to check whether it's true or not? Do you know what I mean? It's going to take a lot of humility to say, guys, I've been wrong for the last 10 years.
Yeah, it takes humility. It takes humility. That's hard. I think one topic that gets to the heart of this for me is this is going to be tricky probably with the American yoga community, but is the topic of vaccinations. For some reason, there are a lot of Western or American, I'm so sorry for that construction. There are a lot of Western American yogis who are anti-vaccine.
Yes, the same in the UK, actually.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yeah.
And because like you said, there's this idea that medicine is bad. Yes, science isn't perfect. There are some, we should question a lot about science. But with vaccines, for me, I that's something I can't throw out. And not that we need every vaccine, but there is so much information about vaccines. And for whatever reasons, the yoga community has just bought it all, hook, line, and sinker. And it's a divisive thing for me. Yeah,
no, I know intelligent people who are friends of mine who are sort of anti-vax, and I feel quite sad about that. Having, had to take some look at the evidence and certainly talk to people who are very qualified to review the evidence. I've also lived in African countries where I've been surrounded by dying children, and that tends to sort of put you in favor of vaccines rather quickly. And if you kind of look at the stuff on kind of polio and how it used to be in the UK till relatively recently, this photographs of stuff that I just didn't have to put up with. And there's always ways around this, but I don't want to kind of spend too much time on this particular issue because I'm sure someone's getting very upset and penning me an email right now. But,
and me. I brought it up.
But also, I wonder if we shouldn't make stands on these things and say, okay, if we're talking about the well-being of children now, should we not make a stand on this? And in some way, without becoming kind of hardcore Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris kind of, science kind of fundamentalists in a different way to say, yeah, let's be open-minded. Let's look at what's out there. Maybe we're wrong about this, but probably not. You know what I mean? Probably not. And that's the best science usually says is, look, given the evidence, it's very likely that these are a positive thing. And I wonder if it isn't worth making stands for, because I noticed in myself as you were saying that, like, oh God, am I going to get into more internet fights? I'm already in enough. And I noticed that hesitancy from you as well. And it's like, it's almost radical to be pro-science in some alternative.
Yeah, in some circles, especially in my political climate right now, where from the president, sorry, I can't believe he's the president, from the president of the United States, there's just been this denouncement and pooling of funding for scientific research.
And this is different in the States to the UK, as we don't, most of Western Europe doesn't have a fundamentalist religious heartland. Kind of Russia does a little bit. Some of Eastern Europe, like Poland's quite Catholic, but most of Western Europe is nominally Christian. And it doesn't have the same sort of fundamentalist vibe about it. Like climate change is the Christian church, the Church of England is massively supportive of climate change, for example. And the narrative is the opposite of the US. And people in the US might not be aware that our religious people are actually more left-wing quite often. There does seem to be a difference. We don't have there's no conversations about evolution being taught in schools in the UK. Like that, we just think that's bizarre and weird. And I know that you've sort of got this sort of two coasts. I look at where the hits come from for this podcast, and it's New York, California, Austin, Texas, Boulder, Colorado, a few islands and the two coasts, basically. Tricky environment to be in.
Yes, it's a tricky environment. But
so you've always got two rebels. You've got left and right, and then you've got the kind of alternative mainstream as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's a tricky environment, but I stand my ground. I still believe in the value of science. I don't think it's perfect. Yeah, but I think it's worthwhile for.
When you started talking about science and yoga, like real science, not the kind of Iyengar saying stuff is science in his book, which isn't true. But that's literally all we're talking about, isn't it? What's true? That's literally all we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's the tricky thing with science and that pursuit with the research is we're trying to find objective universal truths. Yeah. And the thing is that I don't know if that's possible. That's what we claim that we're pursuing, but ultimately human beings conduct the research and they're biased.
And that's the postmodern truth, right? And one reason I think you're particularly screwed that you're getting it from two sides. You've got yoga fundamentalists who have a my guru says, therefore you're wrong. But you also have on the left, particularly in alternative circles, the hardcore postmodernists who are saying there's no such thing as absolute truth. There's always an observer bias, which is true. There's always a scientist who's an impact on the experiment, which is true. But they're taking that to an extreme and says, therefore, there's no truth. How dare you say that don't detoxify the liver? Because there's no such thing as truth. There's only my truth. And so they're the two biggest forces in yoga is the sort of basically.
I see more of the guru followers. I haven't had complaints who are the people who look at the philosophy of science, and question it. But I like to ponder those things. I like to keep myself in check with that reality. So, but I haven't. There's a
strong liberal pluralist thread in modern yoga as well, right? And they're also not too keen on absolute truths.
That's true.
Okay, so we've established that no one likes you and you're screwed, but I love you. and let's if I can make you laugh today, you've got banging on the wall and Trump for a president, so if nothing else, I'll make you smile today.
Laughter's all I have left.
That's all I have left, she said with desperation in her eye and purified water in her glass. So people have probably been wondering, we've been teasing listeners a little bit, which is good. I'd like to tease you. What are some of the most common myths that might be prevalent in yoga and equally in martial arts or anywhere else? What are some of the myths that you can debunk from your book or else?
The most common ones that I still see are that flexibility is an ideal. The more flexible you are, the better. And somehow it's it's tied to spiritual ecstasy.
So being flexible makes you spiritual, which is why 6-year-old Chinese gymnasts are all enlightened masters.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
exactly.
good. We've established that.
Yeah, we can finish the podcast now.
We're done. Yoga's done. Let's get little Mr. Lee in from China to sort it out. So why can you be more flexible? Let me play devil's advocate. Why might being flexible not be a good thing, aside from the fact the obvious ridiculous correlation with sort of spiritual enlightenment? Why might it not be good to be super flexible? Because I was just in a yoga class in London, for example, and I was surrounded by people who looked like high-level gymnasts. Frankly, they're putting their leg behind their head as if they were trying to perform autofellatio. It was really quite astounding to me, even as a relatively flexible guy. Like the level in New York and London and these big cities, particularly of gymnastic yoga, is really incredible now. Like it's impressive and disturbing at the same time. So why might it not be good to be so flexible?
Well, I don't want to demonize it for people. You know, if people are gymnasts and that's what they do and that feels good in their body, fine. But for the general population, I don't think it's something that they need to strive for or compare themselves to, like that, because they can't even touch their toes, that, you know, they're not worthy or they're not as good. Or
the splits probably won't improve my life. Yeah,
it's not going to improve your life. And I think another thing to think about is, you know, why are you pursuing these levels of flexibility? Is it to is it to make your life better? Okay, then why? Is it so you can move better throughout the day and not be in pain? Okay, that's worth it. But maybe there's a point that's good enough, you know, and you don't have to go beyond that point. And then you could also argue that in people who tend to do yoga, that I see a lot, who are already flexible and probably hypermobile, or often I should say hypermobile, that just working on flexibility in a passive way, which is the norm in yoga classes, is not going to help them. And it could possibly lead to injury and pain for that community of people, possibly.
Yeah. So I often start an embodied yoga principles class just by asking people, look, what do you care about? And they tell me their families, their jobs, their love lives, politics. And I say, right, let's do yoga that impacts that. And it might, you know, I'm not going to tell you your values. You tell me your values, and then let's orientate around that. And nobody has ever told me to do the splits or to get flexible. Now, the journey of flexibility may be part of learning things and orientating around stretching as a way of revealing self or working on self. I get that. So I don't want to dismiss that. And it's, as I said, nobody has answered that question, what do you care about, with the answer doing the splits or, standing on one leg for extended periods of time. Like that may be a methodology that's helpful to learn other things, but certainly is an end in itself. It is. So this flexibility, what other ones have you come across? Like this pose was good for your some gland, or the twist I mentioned earlier, the twist detoxify your liver. I mean, like what other kind of just common, just not true ones, like non-controversial, not true things are in your book, for example?
It's fun. The twist one, I thought we were beyond that with, I think in the book we talk about it, that it used to be taught that it detoxifies your organs and massages them. And I was surprised to hear that recently there was maybe an Instagram post. I don't remember the school, but there was a teacher who was saying something like that twists replenish the organs or something like that. I was surprised to see that from this prominent teacher or well-known teacher. I thought we were beyond that. So we're not, but that's okay. You know, it certainly moves organs around, but to say that it squeezes them and flushes out, brings new blood to them, we don't know. That's not quite accurate. And it certainly does not take toxins out of organs. That for sure we know. But I still see that. I still see in my group classes resistance towards engaging glutes in poses like bridge pose.
So if you're doing a bridge, you're supposed to not engage your glutes, but I don't think that's physically possible.
It's probably not.
Yeah.
To the extent that it's taught. I also see that resistance to engaging glutes in something like a bridge pose. People tend to think that it will compress their sciatic, their SI joint, their sacroiliac joint, and cause pain and injury, which we know is not true.
New York going on outside there. Yeah.
You're getting the full.
No, it's okay. I'm getting the New York today. Battering experience.
Yeah,
it's cool.
Yeah, you're going to be.
Not your fault. Yeah. So, I mean, the other ones is kind of like there can be worries about certain things that you'll get injured if you don't do something, right? There can be sort of over caution around certain things.
That's true.
You never do this. You know,
right.
Your knee has to be perfectly aligned the whole time or your knee will break.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, okay. Well, generally you'd want your knee over your ankle or whatever, but it doesn't, you know, you look at kids moving. It's not like they're doing that the whole time.
Exactly. No, that's one I still see a lot too. The knee, the focus on keeping the knee over the ankle and things like warrior poses. That's an interesting one. I don't worry about that in classes.
Yeah.
You know, I remember in one of my trainings, I forget who, it doesn't matter who it was. The teacher was saying, you got to put out fires in the class. You look for fires to put out.
Right.
And I think that the knee over the ankle was one of the fires to look.
It can be a bit neurotic, can't it? I've noticed a lot of yoga teachers, particularly from certain traditions. I was in a Iyengar class in London over the weekend, and it wasn't my fault. It was the only class that was on. It was an accident. I slipped and fell into the class. And the teacher was quite almost neurotic about controlling the students around things that weren't, you know, awfully dangerous. It's not like a complete beginner just doing something crazy that's going to break their neck. It was fairly experienced people, and it seemed almost like a kind of controlling neurotic neurosis, the sort of constant correction of very small things, and even that model of correction, right? Like, and this guy had never met me before. You know, it's not my regular class. He doesn't know my body. He doesn't know what injuries I might be looking after, or why I might have I have a particularly unusual shaped femur or whatever it is. There was just do it this way. Mm-hmm. That sort of dogmatic, authoritarian approach to these things, rather than, okay, here's some basic guidelines, or you might want to feel this or be aware of this relationship. That's pretty common in the martial arts as well.
Oh, yeah. That was my experience early on with Iyengar. I think that's why I was actually drawn to Iyengar early on. I think I have OCD tendencies.
Certainty is appealing, right?
Yeah.
Certainty is incredibly appealing psychologically.
Yeah. And I was drawn to that. And I for whatever reason, I think that it is pervasive amongst some Iyengar teachers. And it does come across as controlling and fear-mongering, and I don't think it's a healthy approach to movement for me personally anymore.
Yeah, I have not a healthy approach to living. I looked at this guy, and this is going to be published away after, so there won't be a kind of revealing anyone's name. And there was a sort of slightly neurotic, controlling tendency to this person's being. And I kind of wondered if that was there before the yoga or as a result of going through a yoga indoctrination, you know. Mm-hmm. And I looked at him, he was a bit uptight, and you could see people sort of looking at each other because it wasn't a normal teacher, it was a cover teacher. And it was, which makes it even more strange, right? And people sort of looking like, this guy needs to chill, you know. And these are like regular Iyengar students. So it's like, was the personality there before or was it not? And to be clear, I do go to Iyengar classes and very much enjoy them at times. So I'm not anti-Iyengar for the Iyengar people out there who feel like I kicked their kitten. There's a very good teacher in Brighton. Okay, what's the single kind of worst, most bullshitty thing you've ever heard a yoga teacher say? Like, I'd love to hear, I hear a lot of just bad instructions that don't make sense.
Oh, God.
I don't know what you mean by that. But is there a time when you've had like a little vomit in your throat, or you've wanted to go print out a copy of your book and just hit it with them immediately? Is there any times you can think of like that? Oh, gosh. I haven't been to yoga classes lately, perhaps for that very reason. You get picky, don't you, after a while? I do. I get picky, and it's hard for me to turn off that voice in my head. So, God, it's funny. I do remember overhearing something recently, and I just kind of. If it comes to you in the podcast at all, feel free to spit it out.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's such a fun question, and I'm blanking right now.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I'm throwing some wild cards at you. Okay, so you felt compelled. I'm hearing just bullshit. You felt compelled to say, "Hang on a minute. Let me help clear some of this stuff up," because otherwise, tell me if I'm wrong here. Otherwise, we're just going to continue, and again, perhaps very well intended, spreading things which aren't true. So
it started as my own personal process of wanting to try to uncover what's true, and then I saw this need for it across the yoga teaching industry and people interested in that approach, and so it's become my niche.
Become your thing, hasn't it? We call it a niche. We call it a niche in England. A niche, yeah. Actually, a quarter of the podcast listeners are in the United States. A quarter in England, and half the rest of the world. So all over, yeah. So
yes, and I think I see the need for it, and pseudoscience is not just in the yoga world, as you said. It's in fitness, it's in nutrition, and those myths, those pseudoscientific myths, are not helping people.
And they're still perpetuated. Like Iyengar's book is still on the teacher training syllabus for almost every teacher training in the UK that I've heard of. And, like on yoga, and while it has some great stuff in, it does just have simply dozens of things that are not true. Like this posture will help with heart attack, or this condition. Like that's a common one, right? If you do downwards dog every day, then you won't get syphilis or whatever. Okay, that's not true. For that one. So
I'm glad you mentioned that, because people are attracted to that. They like to, if they read it in a book that this pose might help this physical condition, I think that's appealing and that's enticing.
Yeah, it's simple, and they want to try and help themselves.
Yeah, but and even though I do see that kind of prescription of poses almost as pills, we have to move away from that, because that is.
Because there is yoga therapy, but there's more intelligent approaches to it. And psychologically, I work with the same thing. I say, look, warrior pose might be good for your confidence, but it depends how you do it. Yeah. And actually, that might not be the root of it might be a lack of self-love that's at the root of your kind of confidence issues. And maybe there's another thing we can do for that. So it's the what, but it's also the how, and it's the individual, and there's all these variables. And some of those claims just seem to be pulled out of nowhere.
Yeah.
I mean, some of them are a bit more grounded, like, that might realistically lower blood pressure, which might actually be good if you're having, strokes. I'm just making this up. Maybe you could tell me one which isn't a myth, and it's certainly some of them seem to have some grounding, but no one had ever tried to test it, because that wasn't in the mentality. If the guru said it was true, it wasn't in the mentality to actually to test things, or even to think. This is what I'm astounded about. Very intelligent people can really drink the Kool-Aid when it comes to yoga or martial arts or whatever. People who in any other field would be questioning. In a business marketing content, they might be like, look, if I spend £1,000, what's the result I'm going to get? Prove it. But then they lose that, or somehow manage to put that aside when they're in a kind of alternative health space. And that I find quite interesting.
It is. It's an interesting phenomenon. I don't know why that happens, but if we want yoga to be therapeutic and be part of an alternative care option that can be used with the medical system, then the medical community argues that we need rigorous research on that alternative process to see how it can work with the more mainstream medical one. And I think there's a lot of validity to that.
In the same way as mindfulness has now sort of opened up and been accepted by the medical community, at least to a greater or lesser extent. So when you started to put this stuff out there and collect the data which exists and which is rapidly growing, I know on your membership website you're kind of constantly kind of updating kind of new science. I'd love to hear some of that in a minute. Did you find the yoga community welcomed you with open arms, or was there resistance, or was there just denial? Like, why is that, like on yoga, for example, still being put on every teacher training in the UK, like without any warnings that it might not have some things in it which just aren't the case scientifically? So, what was the reception when you released this book? Because I know it was a breath of fresh air to me. I was like, thank God. I got tired of having to look everything up myself as well. You know, going, that doesn't sound true. And do you know what I mean? Like, having to Google it. I was like, as soon as your book came out, before it was even hard copy, it was like recommended reading as an ebook to all my students. It was like, look, please read this. I don't want you talking shit in classes that have body yoga principles written on the class. You know, it's like
I so appreciate that. Yeah. I just want to say that I want to update that book. I want to do a second volume. Yeah. My opinions of some things have kind of changed and evolved as time has gone on. But you asked what the reaction was to it.
Yeah. Overall,
the reaction has been positive. I haven't had people trashing me or
stones through the window.
Yeah. If anything, sometimes, because I co-wrote the book with Melissa Gutierrez and Kimberly and Kendall. I love them, of Smarter Bodies. And
are they the ones that swear more than me?
Yes.
They're the sort of naughty friends of yours I've heard on a podcast.
Yes, I adore them. And sometimes their tone can come across as offensive. I don't think we brought that tone into the book so much, certainly into the podcasts that we did together, but that's some of the...
You should never introduce me if I move to New York. Never introduce me. We sound like we'd have far too much fun. But you approach it with a sort of humility and a kind of politeness, the kind of way beyond, and a patience way beyond what I could manage. And I think maybe that's why the tone you bring to it, both in the book and in person, is very pleasant, isn't it? You're not offensive like me.
I see nothing wrong with being offensive. I don't see you as... You're offensive sometimes. Yes, you do like but not all the time. I think your heart is in the right place. And it's my nature. I try to be diplomatic. I try to be open-minded and not fault people for their beliefs. It's just how I am. And
so that's great. I have it's useful. So I have so largely you had a pretty good reception to this. Mm-hmm. And then later on, because the members website, you wanted to keep updating it because it's really cool now. Like loads of research is actually being done, right, on yoga. Like for the first time, really, like proper research is being done.
It's getting better.
Yeah, like what are some of the things that are being discovered, or is there sort of any hot off the press things from the last year that people out there might not know about? And even, you know, we might be yoga teachers, but it might be martial arts teachers or dance teachers who do stretching, or like what are some of the sort of hot off the press discoveries from the research of the last year or two?
The hot off the press. Well, there is a really good, and I'll give you the link for it. There's a library of research called Cochrane Library, the COCHRANE, and they have a really terrific free review of some of the latest research that is out there, and they were very specific about including credible research, and it's on a wide range of topics. And they also call for future research to be more systematic and to have better methods. So we have a long way to go, but I want to share that with your audience because I think it's cool. It's a good overview of some of the most recent research. But to say stuff that's the most exciting, there's so much that I find interesting. I'm such a nerd that the things I find exciting are probably
come on. People are interested.
Numb your brain.
What's interesting? Give us a couple of tidbits.
Well, I think one that I really liked, and this is kind of I did get some negative feedback about this one about the podcast about this, the Bikram yoga study.
Okay.
That we reviewed.
20% more likely to be molested if you go to one of his classes than if you don't. Is that the research?
That's the research. That's the conclusion. Yeah. I'm so glad he is taken down from his pedestal.
I think we can say that without getting sued now.
Yeah. So there was this study that wanted to look at core temperatures. How hot does your body get from yoga? And some of the temperatures that they found were about 104 degrees, which are very dangerous. And
so it does actually heat you up. It's not that you're just feel hot on the skin, but actually inside you're cooler.
Your core temperature. And there was a range. It wasn't that everybody had a core temperature of 104, but that 104 and a little bit above 104, that was the max. That was the highest.
What's that in Celsius, you know?
Oh gosh.
More than you should. Yeah. More than 37.
I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd have to Google that. So that's controversial.
Yeah.
And the myths that are perpetuated about Bikram, that the heat detoxifies your body.
Yeah.
You know, we know that's not true.
You can't detoxify through sweating, right? It might kind of subjectively feel that way, but except for a small amount of urea, if I remember rightly from your book. So you're literally covered in your own piss. You there isn't really like toxin come out, right? There isn't. Right.
There are no toxins coming out. No. From your Bikram yoga class. So, but we should let go of that jargon. But also, there's this possibility that these are dangerous temperatures to be working with for people when they're moving around. And
so when I felt like I might die in that class, because I might have actually died, like there was this danger there.
It's funny you say that, because in the podcast that I did with Catherine on that study, she kind of nonchalantly jokes about it, that you feel great after a Bikram hot yoga class because you almost died and you survived. And you're that's interesting. It's your adrenaline rush.
Wow, because I've had that from martial arts before. When you get choked out and things, and you come back, you feel great, and it's almost as like a sort of reset, and your body's going, "Wow, I've worked in war zones, and there's the same feeling of I survived something intense and crazy." And I wonder how healthy it is to do that regularly. There is a good hot yoga studio near me, actually, and they let you take breaks and let you have plenty of water, so it's not quite as hot as the sort of Bikram ones. It seems a bit more sensible, and you certainly get a nice buzz from it, a nice feeling. And I wonder if there's addictive things in there. I'd be curious if there's any research on the kind of addictive qualities of sort of strong stretching in hot rooms, kind of thing, And that's sort of become a norm, hasn't it? Particularly in what I'd call urban yoga. I was in a sort of vinyasa class in London the weekend, and I did a load of yoga the weekend, and they just didn't open the windows. So even though it wasn't advertised as a hot class, it was pretty hot, and people seem to love the intensity of very dynamic stretching in a hot environment. And to me, it was a little hellish. The teacher was very good, but that environment was a little hellish.
It's not for everybody.
It seemed like that's a sort of, in urban centers now, the norm is hot and vinyasa, which is, vinyasa flow, for those who aren't yogis out there, that's kind of dynamic sequences. So lots and lots of postures, jumping between them, usually lots of Tamas dogs and chaturangas. And that seems to be like most yoga in big cities now. If you go to New York, Moscow, Paris, London, it's something about the hyperactive urbanite working really hard, being really busy, who wants to do a hard yoga class, and not my mum's kind of old school British wheel of yoga, which is very gentle and one posture at a time, slow and considered. Like, I'm fascinated, like, why is that changed? And particularly in urban areas, like New York's a real center. That's why I was making the joke about you being a dancer or something, right? Because most of the teachers are super flexible dancers, as I understand it, ex-dancers. The same in, London. The level of athleticism I was seeing and the level people were pushing themselves in London was really different from any other city in England that I've seen yoga in. In a few different classes I've seen it now, so I don't think it was just particularly this one class. So what's going on there, this urban yoga phenomena?
Is it the type A personalities that are gravitating
type A culture, maybe,
to urban populations? Is it the uber competitiveness? This is a side note, but I was doing grocery shopping the other day, and I try to go at off times because I don't like to deal with the crowds. I guess Bikram's being tortured again. And I went at a busy time, and it was such mayhem.
The shopping center.
Not making eye contact and rushing past each other and pushing in front of each other to get food at the supermarket. It's just this competitive environment. And I think that happens a little bit in the fitness world, like in the gyms here in New York City. CrossFits are very popular, and those kinds of extreme sporting. And
I wonder if that's the only way people, it's just an expression of that type A personality / culture / speed of modern life. And I'm bringing this up in this podcast because it feels like the world's got more like New York. I was in New York for the first time 20 years ago, and I thought, fucking hell, these people need to calm the fuck down. And then like now it seems like more of the world has that vibe. Like kind of led the way there, LA, New York. But it seems like that's become the normal. So
that makes me very sad.
Yeah, I mean, Hong Kong's always been like that, Moscow a bit. But now it's become more and more normal elsewhere to go fast and hard. And so maybe the yoga is just an expression of that. But what I've also noticed is it seems like it's the only way people in that lifestyle can relax is if they go to such an extreme. Like what I noticed in this vinyasa class is at the end of class, they all kind of collapsed in a sweaty puddle. And I thought, my God, that's the only way you can relax.
Yes.
Is to go to a point of total exhaustion.
Yes. And I don't know if this is a popular expression where you are, but popular classes, people like a class if they felt like they got their asses kicked. Like if they go to a teacher, really kicked our asses. That was awesome.
No pain, no gain kind of work ethic.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what that is. I don't know.
Maybe something about
there's nothing wrong with challenging yourself. There's nothing wrong and having goals and pursuits on a physical level, but the need to exhaust yourself and go to the brink of pain and I don't know.
That's why nowadays I just punch all my students in the face when they walk in and say, right, the pain sorted. Now let's just do a normal yoga class. That was a joke. So what I have heard now also is teachers saying, look, because teachers saying, I don't really want to do this intense, but I won't get students unless I do. Like, unless I
feel that way.
Do you know what I mean? Like, unless I make them suffer and they feel the burn, as it were, like it was calisthenics, they're not going to come back because they won't feel like they've gained anything. And like Feldenkrais, for example, is phenomenally unpopular at the opposite end of the spectrum. It's like the least popular embodied art, despite, in my opinion, being way better for building range of motion than yoga, the modern postural yoga generally is. Like 10 times better at that.
I agree.
Just at flexibility, let alone anything else. But it's massively unpopular.
Yeah.
And I think it's because you don't get your ass kicked in Feldenkrais.
Yes. You don't feel like you're doing something. You're not getting your workout. You're not getting your money's worth.
So maybe
it's also an obsession with our aesthetics. Weight issues, people thinking they need to look a certain way. And the way you can look a certain way is if you tax your body to an extreme.
So yoga's not that great for calorie burning. That's another one of the myths in your book. Like I saw a hot yoga studio, it had up on the wall 1,000 calories you'll burn per class, and I just went, that's not true. Like you'd have to be running. No. You'd have to be running for an hour at high speed to burn 1,000 calories. I mean, even then I think it would be hard. So it might feel like a hard workout, but even on that front, it's not that efficient.
Yeah. Yeah. And there was a study that we reviewed on that actually. There's a woman who does high intensity, fast vinyasa yoga, and she started doing some research on it because she thinks it is a good alternative for high impact exercise. And the research found that your heart rate and the calories burned, it's really at a level of moderate intensity, even though she was moving really fast. And
I used to have a heart rate monitor as I walked to hot yoga, and I did like a hot yoga thing for a month to see what it was about. It wasn't Bikram, as I said, a bit more moderate, good studio actually. And heart rate monitor was higher when I was walking fast to the class than in the class for about 80% of the class. So about 20% of the class was the equivalent of fast walking, spikes. And that's, it's fairly rigorous class, but it's still walking there. I burnt way more calories than in the class. Like the 30 minutes walk there and back was more calories burnt than the hour, and a higher heart rate consistency than the hour in the class. And that
your experience matches the
data. That was just my system of Fitbit, but it sounds like it matches. But so it does sort of provide an almost ethical dilemma, doesn't it, for teachers? Like, do we... And the emotional equivalent of this is that people in personal growth want to cry and scream, right? And if I do a personal growth workshop with embodiment yoga principles where they get some really good insights, but they're not distraught or angry or some sort of intense emotion, then they may feel like they haven't learned anything. It's like it has to be that's the emotional equivalent of being physically in pain.
Interesting.
It's the same phenomena, actually.
Yeah.
And it provides almost like an ethical dilemma, I think, for teachers.
Yeah. Well, my brain just went through rapid fire. I think that certainly in America, we're addicted to stimulation and heights. Everything has to be like at these intense levels. And if you're not experiencing something at that intense level, then it's, you're bored, or it's scary, or I don't know, things have to be at this intensity. So maybe we're a little bit addicted to that. And then the other thing, I just lost it. Whatever the other rapid fire thing that went through my brain, it's gone.
So you talk about rapid intensity, people being addicted to intensities, emotions, might be as much the emotional existential side as that, as also this implicit belief. I think it's just an implicit belief that pain equals gain.
Yeah.
That is what we are taught to believe, I think there's maybe almost like a self-punishment in it. There's something a little, and I pointed this out on a yoga forum and people did not like it. It's something very S&M-y. And I say that with the greatest respect for the S&M community, who actually have a way better understanding of consent than yoga people, generally. That's improving. Though it's something very S&M-y. Like yoga is one of the few places, I think Remsky points this out, that it's one of the few places you can go and hurt yourself and it's okay. Like if I went just in the supermarket whipping myself and, just sitting on a radiator until I was sweating, people would think I was weird. But if I go to a yoga class, I can be in quite extreme physical discomfort, which breaks through that numbing, and people will not only be okay with it, they'll think it's spiritual.
They'll think it's spiritual.
They'll be impressed.
They'll be impressed. But I think that willingness to be in pain is not just in yoga, it's also in fitness.
Sure. It's fitness culture, right?
It's fitness culture.
Yeah. And you see things about like being drilled, the sort of military type things very much come from fitness into yoga, hasn't it? And, there was roots, obviously, there's Ashtanga and things like that of military anyway, but.
Tadasana, I can't tell you how many times I've been in a class where Tadasana is taught as if it's a military. It feels like it's being taught as a military
posture. That's another nice one about proving things, actually. Like one of my teachers says, you think you're standing straight, and he has people push you from each side. It's a simple thing, just with two fingers, very gently on the shoulder, and you'll notice the traditional Tadasana is actually massively out of balance in one direction. And it's a simple test, but I've never seen a yoga teacher think to test the posture. In terms of its structural stability. It's very easy to do. You can say, look, do you mind if I touch you? Do you mind if I give you a little push? You can move a posture in different directions and go, oh, look, you're out of balance to the left because you just fell to the left. Like that's a scientific principle. It's not the same as a
perturbation.
Study. But that's just not in the mindset of martial artists or yogis to think testing. That's Paul Linden's thing. And Paul Linden, by his own admission, is slightly autistic and very scientifically minded. He just tests everything. So there's a claim that's made, like this will do this. And he'll just say, let's see. That's pretty much his only answer to any question. And it's that mentality of testing, which I think as much as a mindset, as yes, there's the scientific data, but to actually put things to the test, I think even isn't generally done.
No, you're right. I would like to see more of that. I'd like to see that as a mindset in general.
You're having political despair around this. There's a certain despair under your smile.
Oh, God. Yeah.
Can I name that? Is that allowed?
Cannot be masked. No. Yeah.
No. And that's okay. So, well, why don't we go there then if it's not too painful? And feel free to tell me to bugger off. How is it to do yoga in a climate of oppositional polarity between groups of people? It's almost like a civil war in the States, from what I can gather, in terms of mentality, in a climate of fear, in a climate of despair. Is this orange buffoon really in charge of our country? Like, how is it to be going to this like yoga spiritual practice in a special place with the special words, separate from the world, while the world's just like burning?
Oh, so much to say. Number one, I think every studio has a different approach to it.
Yeah.
Every teacher has a different approach to it. I do not bring politics into the yoga room. And for me, spirituality is out of my domain. I don't profess to
not qualified
teach spirituality. For me, movement is spiritual. The physical experience is spiritual for me, but I'm not trying to teach spirituality to people.
Sure.
So I don't feel like I'm in this sacred space, and it's difficult to maintain that sacred feeling.
Yeah.
So that's my approach. And it sounds like hell is upon me, like all around.
It's really set a nice tone, actually. We should thank them. It's set a nice tone for the podcast.
Yeah. So that's that. But within the studio, I live in a bubble in New York City. We are mostly Democrats. And even though I do have Republican friends and I do get into discussions about the politics, for the most part, I encounter people who are like-minded as like me. But at the studio, occasionally we'll have someone who is clearly of a different background and for some reason feels that they can openly talk about that in a way that can be so offensive to people around them. They're just oblivious to the environment and saying things that are just so provocative. And that's always astounding to me, that someone who's coming to a yoga studio doesn't have that awareness to be careful with who might be around them and how their words might be perceived.
Okay, so someone expressing a more conservative point of view, do you mean, or just sort of outlandish racism, or what?
Outlandish racism.
Okay, so that surprises me in a way, because I have seen people almost assume that everyone in yoga would be kind of liberal or left leaning, and that's not the case. And I have some conservative leanings myself these days. I'm kind of mixed on different issues. And certainly a case could be made that posture yoga in some ways is quite conservative in that it tends to look back and be about tradition. It tends to be about the individual taking responsibility. There is actually a case to be made that yoga traditionally as a practice has with a small c. I don't mean Trump supporting or Republican, but yoga could be considered a conservative with a small c practice.
Yeah, no, and that actually correlates to that same person who might say something inappropriate in the lounge of the yoga studio might take great issue with me expressing the fact that I don't like saying namaste at the end of a class, because it feels inauthentic.
Right. Okay.
And, how dare I break with the tradition? And, that person has been to Sri Lanka, and that's what everyone says. They all say namaste. And
it means hello in that context. It just means hi.
And how dare I throw that out? It's part of the tradition. Yes.
It's also bad Sanskrit for a teacher. Apparently, my Sanskrit scholar friend tells me to say namaste for a teacher, because that's when you're referring to a group, you wouldn't say namaste. But anyway, that's a Sanskrit hair splitting. But,
well, I didn't know that.
It's a good thing to take back when someone says you're breaking a tradition, is the tradition's wrong anyway. But so there's some interesting tensions, aren't there? And there's interesting places in this. And part of me wants to just keep politics out of embodiment. Another part of me says, politics is inherent to embodiment and yoga and martial arts, whatever, because we're always working with the body politic.
Yeah, no, it's inherent. It is. And I think it's up to the teacher to decide if they want to address it. It's clearly there. Yeah. But it's up to the teacher to decide if and when and how to address it. And I choose not to bring it into the classroom.
Because it's not really a context for us to be pushing our agendas. And I've had people surprised, because on my private Facebook, which is fairly public, but it's still my own personal Facebook, I'll say some fairly political or things or views on this or that. And I won't do that in a class. And the reason is I'm like, well, this is my personal Facebook. And when I'm teaching, someone has not paid me money to hear my views on gender or to hear my views on American politics, left or right. They haven't paid me money for that. And actually, it's not helpful and it's not serving anyone. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to actually alienate anyone in my class, including the more conservative people.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in alienating them, and they haven't paid for me to do that. And I'm out of the realms of my professional expertise. So when I'm at work, I don't do that. And, they're sometimes surprised because on my personal Facebook, I might. And I go, well, that's me, like, down the pub. That's personal context,
Which, by the way, I want to spend some time with you in a pub one day. I think that would be really
I don't drink, but I can get you smashed if you're ever in Brighton. You're
I don't need to be smashed. I just
in a pub, a nice Well, there's some good British pubs, and I'm sure there's some good Irish pubs in New York.
Yes,
I managed to find an Irish dive bar in Moscow last time I was there, and immediately felt at home. And I tried to order a non-alcoholic drink, and they refused. And they said, we sell beer, vodka, and coffee in Russian. And eventually, when I explained I was an alcoholic, they gave me tap water very begrudgingly. But so that's the kind of establishments I frequent, dodgy Irish metal bars. So maybe one day. I'm sure the listeners aren't too interested in this. However, so last kind of topic, or probably the last one. You sent me a few things to think about beforehand, and I thought one of them was really good, and some friends of mine have been thinking about this too recently. How, when yoga is a global mega business, and there's some statistics on now, so it really has like millions, if not billions of dollars are spent a year on this. How is it that yoga teachers all over the world, except for a very small minority of the elite rock stars, 99% of yoga teachers, I think that's a pretty realistic figure, are at best just getting by?
Yes.
Like they're not rich.
Right.
Like most of them, and I know many who are 20, 30 years experience, so the equivalent of a surgeon who was a massive consultant, high-end, engineer or architect after 30 years would be at the top of their trade, really skilled people by any assessment. I know one I was speaking to recently who's on, government benefits just because they can't get by. Or they're getting, another one I was speaking to recently was getting ripped off by a studio, and the studio was taking just so much more than they were getting. So how is it that yoga teachers, despite the popularity of yoga, are poor today?
Yeah. Something I think about a lot. In New York City, I think it's the oversaturation of teachers.
Supply and demand, right? It's just too many.
Too many teachers. And that's how yoga studios make money a lot of the time, is with teacher training. So they're just churning out teachers.
It's a pyramid scheme.
Yeah, it's a pyramid scheme. Oh, God. Yeah. And that's part of it. There's oversaturation. And maybe that if teachers were more honest about their incomes, there would be less people taking those teacher training. I had a student recently ask me, she's thinking of changing careers, and she loves yoga. And she's thinking about transitioning into wellness and teaching yoga. And I said, well, we need to have a chat then, because you might be a little bit misguided about how your life is going to change, because she's executive assistant right now at a financial firm.
Sure, it's a big change.
So,
sometimes the successful ones are the ones that either had, sorry if I just interrupt, sometimes the successful teachers are the ones that had a marketing background beforehand, or they had money beforehand, or they have a rich husband or wife who's...
Well, let's go into that, the rich husband or wife. What I see is mostly women who are becoming teachers, and they have a partner who makes more money than they do, and they're able to ride the ups and downs of the income that
pays for some cool branding for them to have, pays for them to have a cool website.
Yeah. And, it takes longer to establish a career as a yoga teacher. It's possible, but I think that that setup of women with wealthier husbands, or with someone in their house who's making more money than they are, that's so prevalent. I see that so many times.
And then you've got a class issue in yoga, right? Because the only people who can become successful, it's the same in aid work, humanitarian aid work, because you have to volunteer for years. That was a field I was in. It's full of posh kids because their parents are bankrolling them. Yeah. Like my parents would not be able to afford to spend me for volunteer for 2 or 3 years, on the humanitarian aid programs, intern in the office for free, because they had bills to pay and they couldn't pay my bills. It was really tough. I was surrounded by posh kids as a result. And I think yoga is becoming, the sort of teachers that are able to fund it. Often there's a class thing. And then there's this weird subs in foreign countries where they go to live in Goa or Bali, and they sort of act like a kind of weird white queen. And, in this kind of context as well, there's a class issue there too. And I find it weird and disturbing. I don't know why people aren't talking about this.
It is disturbing. It's class. It's also race. The most of the people I see taking classes are wealthy white people.
True.
At least in my studios and in a lot of the studios I see in New York. That's changing, but it's expensive. in
Yeah,
your
£17. I just paid £17 for a yoga class in London. That's like, how much is that? Not quite $30, you know? And if you want to do one at the top of the Shard, that's like £30. But I mean, just a regular yoga class for an hour on a Saturday morning was £17.
We have the same pricing here. We have the
Yeah.
same.
And I mean, a lot of that's rents as well, right? Like, to be fair to the studios, like rents are insane in London and New York and major cities.
Yes.
Like, is it Jay Brown just closed down his studio, mate of mine? And it's like, you know, because of rent, you know, that is the big thing. It means class prices get hiked. And that also puts the pressure on cramming everyone together, doing the most intense classes we were talking about before, and the teacher trainings to actually make some money. So it actually creates an economic pressure towards a certain way of doing yoga and making even more yoga teachers, which makes the whole problem even worse. There's a bubble, isn't there? There's like a yoga bubble. Yeah.
We've got some issues.
So everyone has to niche. I have my niche. You have your niche. That seems to be the only ethical solution I can come up with, is to like heavily niche and get really good at something.
Yeah. Well, you could say that for any industry today.
It's a mature market. That in marketing terms, that's just how mature markets work. They get heavily niched.
Yeah. No, but it's a problem. I with this is a small example of how I'm aware of it, but with the yoga research membership site, I'm very careful about the image, or I try to be careful about the stock images that we use, because there's so many photographs of happy, skinny white women doing yoga. It's really hard to find other kinds of photographs to represent all the other populations who might be interested.
If you Google Yoga Journal, look at the front covers. There's almost no men. There's very few people of color. There are some, usually a few Asians and a couple of black people. But mostly it's slim white women in their kind of mid-30s, I would guess. There's a particular age, a particular body shape. You know, like me and you ain't ever going to look like that, just in terms of the body shape we were born with. I almost got a body image complex after 2 days in London doing yoga. I tell you, this weekend. I mean, I'm relatively strong, I'm relatively flexible, but, you know, I'm a little bit of a hobbit, you know? And it's, you know, I'm never going to be one of these lithe kind of skinny guys. And I haven't got any tattoos either, so that needs to change. It was like Motorhead bred with a modeling agency in this place. But you know, I can see how you could get body image issues, and as you say, the lack of representation of that. I mean, it does seem like yoga's getting better at understanding sort of body image stuff. It does seem like that's on the agenda a little bit now. So again, I promised I'd be nice to yoga this year. That's one of my resolutions. It does feel like a lot of the issues we're talking about are on the radar for people for the first time.
Yeah, I think that they are.
I wonder, one, though, about the sort of poverty and being poor, though, is this having to portray an image of perfection, like the sort of plastered on fake smile, having to be spiritually perfect. And I wonder if that makes it quite difficult and shameful for a yoga teacher to say, I'm poor. You know what I mean? That image of having to constantly look good includes the financial. Like, how do you afford those expensive Greek movies otherwise, right?
Yeah.
Like, all that health food ain't cheap. But
that's interesting. I could also see it the other way, because for a while, it was hard for a yoga teacher to say that they were running a business. And I still encounter that sometimes, that there's this shame in asking to be compensated, period, let alone being compensated well for the work, because you're supposed to be of service to people.
Yeah, I got brought in to teach embodied marketing at a yoga for cancer course. You can imagine, you've got a really good course by a friend of mine, Jude Murray. And she said, people are doing this thing which is incredibly worthwhile with incredibly difficult populations, and they don't want to ask for any money for it. And it's like, but how can they sustain themselves, And that's not to say you don't make it accessible or, find ways to other people, to get grants or government or whatever. But someone has to pay if you're going to do that for a job. And that was a more exaggerated version of what I'd seen in yoga generally, that money isn't spiritual. Good people don't ask for money. It's all done by donation. And that's just not, maybe in India as a Buddhist monk, you could get away with that because people would bring you food and there's a culture for that, but that doesn't pay the electricity bill in New York, right? So yeah, so I see the money shame side too. It's a weird relationship with money I see in yoga. That's on the one hand very grasping, on the other hand very denying it.
Yeah,
it can be. It's one of the juiciest.
It's almost schizophrenic, right?
A little bit, yeah. And I know when we do courses, we look at money, sex, and power as 3 themes, and the hardest one is money. Like that's the one that really people. We have a bunch of embodied yoga principles, postures, exploring, giving, receiving, containing money, and that's the thing that I think most triggers people. Not other taboos like death or sex. You'd think would be more triggering. So I think it is still a massive taboo. I'm surprised to hear that in a way from sort of New York, but Britain even more. We have this thing of you don't tell each other your salary in Britain, and money, so it's terribly uncouth.
Yeah.
We're pretty much out of time.
Okay.
I could talk more with you loads. I really enjoyed this.
Likewise.
Yeah, the banging in the wall hasn't ruined my enjoyment. I hope not listeners either. 2 things in terms of finding out more about you. Where will people go?
I have 2 websites. For my yoga teaching, it's arianayoga.com, and my podcast is also on there. And the yoga research membership website is yogaresearchandbeyond.com. Go ahead.
You've got all the social media on there. I really want to recommend Exposing Yoga Myths to people, even if it's going to be updated. That is a really sort of quick and easy read for people, just to not be spreading things that aren't true. Well worth a look. And if you run a teacher training, I would say make it mandatory out there. Because like that, I'm not saying that just because you're my mate. I came to that conclusion before I talked to you. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. And do you have a final message about the body you would like listeners to hear?
Oh, a final message about the body. Well, along with what we were saying, instead of your physical practice being about beating it up, beating your body up, how about just taking time to relate to your body? That's it. Have a relationship with your body.
Nice. I think we're on the same page there. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe to get more. If you'd like to help us build the Embodied Tribe, leave a review on iTunes or share this on your social media. If you're interested in training globally, sign up to receive the newsletter at embodiedfacilitator.com. Until next time, welcome home to the body.